Okay, so what does the ideal conversationalist look like? I think we should take some advice from Paul Grice, famous philosopher of language, who wrote a piece called Logic and Conversation, in which he identifies some maxims of good conversation. He says, regarding the quantity of information you provide, be as informative as is required for your current purpose, and don't say more than is necessary. So that's it. How much should you write about a particular issue? Only as much as is absolutely necessary to get your point across, and no more. Don't belabor a point, and don't say too little so that you leave your reader incapable of understanding it. That's pretty straightforward, practical advice. Don't say things you don't believe, and don't make claims without evidence. Your work will be better if you actually believe what you're arguing. And sometimes this is referred to as authenticity. You should give your audience a sense that you actually stand behind the claims that are being made. And if you connect with the claims in that kind of way, you'll work harder to ensure that they're actually true. So in general, this kind of connection to your writing is a good thing. It helps you write better philosophical papers. And don't make claims without evidence. That also is a fundamental maxim of philosophical writing. It's very common to find mere assertions in students' essays where they just assert something as if it's the case. But you can't do that. In philosophical writing, you have to provide evidence. If you are going to say something and not provide evidence for it, that's called an assumption. And you have to identify your assumptions at the very beginning of your paper in your introduction. If you're going to assume something, tell everybody in your introduction so they don't get upset with you later when you assume some fundamental claim that they thought you were going to give them evidence for. And this maxim he describes under the term clarity. Basically, prune your prose. Make sure your prose is as economical as possible. Don't use more words than you actually need. Forget about flowery adjectives. Forget about long, florid sentences. You want to be clear and simple as the truth. Just be straightforward. It doesn't have to be boring. This is not the same as just plain speech. You can have a personality and reflect that personality in your writing, but you don't want a bunch of fancy, obscure terminology that isn't getting your point across. Avoid obscurity of expression. Avoid ambiguity. Don't write sentences that could mean two or more things. Try to make sure you're only communicating one meaning per sentence. Prefer strong active verbs to passive verbs. So instead of saying it is generally agreed that, say virtue epistemologists generally agree. So in a sentence with an active verb, the subject of the sentence does the action. In a sentence with a passive verb, the subject of the sentence receives the action. And in general, you only want to use the passive tense when you're trying to communicate that the subject in this case is passive, is receiving the action. So here's an example of a place where you might use the passive voice. We do not control our passions, but rather are controlled by them. And you see there, choosing to use the passive voice, are controlled by, communicates the message of the sentence. Your whole point is that our passions aren't under our control, rather they control us. So it makes sense to structure the sentence so that you're receiving the action from the passions. Otherwise, stick to the active voice. It's easier to read, it's more lively, it sounds better. In general, you want to use verbs instead of nominalizations. What's a nominalization? A nominalization is when you take an adjective, a verb, or another noun, and you add one of these suffixes on it. When you do that, you create a new noun. So you take implacable and you turn it into implacability. You take calibrate and you turn it into calibration. You take crony and you turn it into cronyism. The author of this book, Stylish Academic Writing, calls nominalizations zombie nouns because, as she puts it, they cannibalize active verbs, suck the lifeblood out of adjectives, substitute abstract entities for human beings. Here's an example, a kind of funny example. The proliferation of nominalizations in discursive formation may be an indication of a tendency towards pomposity and abstraction. So that has quite a few nominalizations in it, and here's what it actually means. Writers who overload their sentences with nominalizations tend to sound pompous and abstract. Try to write more like the second one of those, not like the first one. To continue with clarity, it makes your reader's life easier if you place the subject of your sentence close to the principal verb of that sentence and put them both at the beginning of a sentence. It's just easier for the mind to follow. And you might think, well, why does he even bother mentioning that? But the point is, these are all things that make what you're writing easier to read. And in philosophy, you want the writing to be easy to read because the ideas are difficult. For the same reason, you want to try to write short sentences. I would recommend fewer than 15 words, but even have some variety there so you can have sentences that are as short as 7 words. Short sentences make it easier to follow what you're saying. Make your paragraphs no longer than 6 sentences. Obviously, that's not an absolute rule, but it's a rule of thumb. Control the number of topics per paragraph. You want to have 1 topic per paragraph and 1 message per sentence. And finally, you should always place familiar information before the unfamiliar information. Okay, so these are all rules of thumb that will help your writing be more clear. Finally, here's a quote from Arthur Schopenhauer that I really love, that I think speaks to the point of clarity. He writes, "Nothing is easier than to write so that no one can understand. Just as contrarily, nothing is more difficult than to express deep things in such a way that everyone must necessarily grasp them." Try to write about difficult things in a way that everybody, whoever actually puts the time into reading your paper, must necessarily understand what it is that you're trying to say. The only rule of relation is be relevant. There's a lot packed into this very succinct imperative. Grice's work spawned a research program in speech pragmatics called relevance theory. So this is a way of understanding how human language functions from a pragmatic point of view. And the basic tenet of that theory is that all utterances, or all speech acts, raise expectations of relevance because the search for relevance is a basic feature of human cognition. So the idea is that the mind is hungry for relevant information. It wants to know more about what it already cares about. So the mind is hungry for relevant information. So that is what the good conversationalist always offers to his reader. Relevance should guide your approach in everything. So you should join a conversation that's relevant to your interests. Look at the assignments and always try to find the one that's most relevant to interests that you already have or interests that you want to develop. You'll do better work if you're interested. Once you select a conversation to join, choose a thesis that's relevant to that conversation. Respond to the moves that people are actually making in that conversation. Even if you're going to reframe the whole conversation and say we should look at it differently, make sure you're speaking to relevant concerns of the conversation that you've chosen. Otherwise, choose a different one. Finally, you should ask yourself, how can I make this relevant to my reader? That's something that you constantly want to be bearing in mind. You should think of your reader as one of your peers, maybe the most competent of your peers. And you should ask yourself, why should my reader care about this? Relevance should be the consideration that gives your paper its structure. Everything in your paper should be relevant to your thesis. Every paragraph in a section must be relevant to the aims of that particular section. Every sentence in a paragraph should be relevant to the single topic that that paragraph is about. Every word in a sentence should be relevant to the single message that that sentence conveys, and you should revise and rewrite your writing with these aims in mind. And be ruthless. Get rid of all the stuff that doesn't actually play a role in your overall argument, and you will create beautiful, streamlined, architecturally elegant essays. In summary, the ideal conversationalist only gives her conversation partner the information they need. She speaks truthfully and supports what she says with evidence. She speaks clearly, and she only says what is relevant. Those are the maxims that should guide everything that you write when you're writing philosophy. And I just wanted to point out quickly that adhering to these rules will help you meet the criteria listed in elements 1 and 2 of the marking rubric. So if you look at elements 1 and 2 of the marking rubric, you'll see that the things that you're trying to achieve at the highest level of those elements are the things that are described by Grice's maxims.